Picture this. You are 7 years old, standing barefoot on cold marble floors in the pre-dawn darkness of Versailles. The year is 1668, and your small hands shake not from the chill, but from the knowledge that your tutors are watching your every breath, cataloguing each tremor as evidence of weakness that must be beaten from your royal bones. The heavy brocade curtains hang like prison walls around your gilded cage, and through the tall windows, you can see other children playing freely in the gardens below, while you remain trapped in lessons designed to strip away everything human about you. Your stomach gnaws with hunger because meals are rationed to teach you discipline. Your back aches from hours of forced posture training, and your mind reels from the constant psychological manipulation disguised as education. This is not a fairy tale about royal privilege. This is the reality of how European monarchies forged their heirs through centuries of systematic psychological torture that would make modern child psychologists weep with horror. Before diving into these forgotten stories of royal suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The royal nursery was never a place of comfort or maternal warmth. It was a laboratory where human children were systematically transformed into living symbols of divine authority through methods that combined medieval brutality with Renaissance sophistication. Palace servants whispered about the screams that echoed through marble corridors at night, the sound of young princes and princesses being molded into instruments of absolute power through techniques that destroyed their humanity while preserving their usefulness to the crown. Royal children were separated from their mothers within hours of birth, not from cruelty, but from calculated design. The Spanish Habsburgs perfected this practice during the 16th century, understanding that natural maternal bonds would interfere with the psychological conditioning necessary to create effective monarchs. Wet nurses were selected not for their nurturing qualities, but for their ability to maintain emotional distance while providing basic physical care. These women were rotated frequently to prevent any attachment from forming, ensuring that royal children learned from their earliest moments that human connections were temporary and conditional. The educational regimen imposed upon royal heirs would have impressed the most dedicated military drill sergeants. Prince Louis XIV of France began formal lessons at age 4, rising before dawn for 12 hours of instruction that combined academic subjects with elaborate protocols designed to crush any trace of spontaneous behavior. His tutors recorded every gesture, every facial expression, every moment of hesitation or rebellion in detailed journals that were reviewed by court officials and used to refine future training methods. Physical discipline formed the cornerstone of royal education, but it was administered with scientific precision rather than random violence. Court physicians developed elaborate theories about how different types of pain could shape character development. Beatings were scheduled according to astrological charts, with specific instruments chosen based on the child's temperament and the particular weaknesses that needed correction. A whip made from shark skin might be used to address pride, while birch rods were reserved for correcting laziness. The goal was not merely punishment, but psychological reconditioning that would associate disobedience with physical agony. The isolation imposed upon royal children extended far beyond mere physical separation. They were forbidden from forming friendships with anyone of their own age, instead surrounded by adults whose primary loyalty was to the crown rather than the child's well-being. Playmates, when allowed, were carefully selected servants' children who had been trained to lose every game, agree with every opinion, and treat the royal heir with exaggerated deference that created a distorted understanding of human relationships. Sleep became another tool of psychological manipulation. Royal children were awakened at random intervals throughout the night for lessons in vigilance and self-control. They learned to function on minimal rest, to remain alert despite exhaustion, and to never show weakness, even when their bodies screamed for relief. Palace records document princes falling asleep during formal ceremonies, only to be beaten awake and forced to continue their duties with perfect composure. The dining rituals imposed upon royal heirs transformed basic nutrition into elaborate exercises in self-denial and social performance. Meals were served according to complex protocols that required perfect posture, precise timing, and constant awareness of hierarchical relationships. Food was often deliberately underseasoned or served cold to teach endurance of discomfort. Royal children learned to eat foods they despised with expressions of gratitude, to ignore hunger pangs during ceremonial fasts, and to maintain dignity even when their stomachs cramped from deliberate nutritional deprivation. Language instruction went far beyond mere vocabulary and grammar. Royal children were required to master multiple languages, not for communication, but as exercises in mental discipline and cultural domination. They learned to speak Latin during formal ceremonies, French for diplomatic negotiations, and their native tongue for addressing subjects, but each language carried specific emotional restrictions. Expressions of pain, fear, or genuine joy were forbidden in any tongue, creating internal barriers that separated their public personas from their private suffering. Religious education served as perhaps the most sophisticated form of psychological conditioning. Royal children were taught that their suffering was not only necessary, but divinely ordained. Every beating, every humiliation, every moment of terror was reframed as preparation for the sacred burden of kingship. They learned to associate personal pain with spiritual purification, creating internal justifications for the abuse they endured, while simultaneously preparing them to inflict similar treatment upon their future subjects. The courtly entertainment that surrounded royal children appeared magnificent from the outside, but functioned as elaborate psychological experiments designed to test their emotional control under extreme conditions. Elaborate masks and theatrical performances would suddenly incorporate elements designed to trigger specific fears or desires, with hidden observers recording the child's reactions for later analysis. A seemingly innocent puppet show might include scenes of parental abandonment or royal assassination, while court musicians would play melodies specifically composed to evoke particular emotional responses that could then be measured and manipulated. Academic subjects were weaponized into tools of psychological conditioning that went far beyond traditional education. History lessons focused exclusively on royal ancestors who had triumphed through ruthless application of power, with detailed descriptions of torture methods, execution techniques, and population control strategies. Mathematics was taught through calculating taxation burdens, military casualties, and the economic costs of different forms of punishment. Natural philosophy emphasized the hierarchical ordering of creation, with extensive lessons on why some beings were born to rule, while others existed solely to serve. The physical environment of royal education was carefully designed to reinforce psychological conditioning through architectural symbolism. Classrooms were positioned in palace towers that emphasized elevation above common humanity, with windows offering views of gardens where servants toiled while the royal child studied portraits of dead monarchs lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge every moment of weakness or rebellion. Furniture was sized and positioned to create constant physical discomfort that served as background stress designed to build tolerance for future hardships. Medical examinations of royal children were conducted with the cold precision of livestock evaluation, transforming their developing bodies into objects of scientific study rather than vessels of human experience. Palace physicians would measure limbs, test reflexes, and document physical development with meticulous attention to detail. But their primary concern was not health or well-being. These examinations served to identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited during training, physical limitations that might interfere with royal duties, and constitutional traits that required correction through targeted psychological intervention. The doctors would probe and manipulate young bodies while discussing their findings in clinical Latin, treating the royal children as specimens rather than patients. Heart rates were monitored during induced stress to measure emotional resilience. Breathing patterns were analysed while children were subjected to deliberate, frightening scenarios. Even basic reflexes became data points in elaborate charts that tracked the progress of psychological conditioning over months and years of systematic abuse. Sleep deprivation evolved into an art form practiced by royal tutors who understood that exhaustion made children more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The carefully orchestrated schedule of random awakenings served multiple purposes beyond mere endurance training. Chronic fatigue created a dreamlike state of consciousness where reality became malleable, allowing tutors to implant suggestions and behavioral modifications that would have been rejected by fully alert minds. During these midnight sessions, royal children were subjected to elaborate scenarios designed to blur the boundaries between waking and sleeping consciousness. They might be awakened to find their rooms rearranged, their possessions moved, or their servants replaced with strangers, creating a persistent sense of uncertainty about the nature of reality itself. These experiences taught them to question their own perceptions while increasing their dependence on authority figures who claimed to provide stability in an otherwise chaotic world. The manipulation of time itself became a powerful tool in the psychological arsenal deployed against royal heirs. Clocks were deliberately altered or removed from their living spaces, creating temporal disorientation that made it impossible to develop natural rhythms or anticipate daily events. Meals might be served at dawn one day and midnight the next. Lessons could last for 2 hours or 12. And sleep periods varied according to no discernible pattern. This temporal confusion served to break down the child's sense of personal agency and control over their environment. Unable to predict when basic needs would be met or when demands would be made upon them, royal children learned to exist in a state of constant hypervigilance that exhausted their psychological resources and made resistance increasingly difficult. The carefully curated social environment surrounding royal children included elaborate deception designed to distort their understanding of human nature and social relationships. Servants were instructed to display exaggerated emotions according to complex scripts that bore no relationship to their genuine feelings. A maid might weep dramatically over a broken vase while secretly celebrating, or express joy at news that actually filled her with dread. These performances taught royal children that human emotions were unreliable indicators of truth, that expressions of loyalty or affection could be manufactured on command, and that their own emotional responses were potentially dangerous sources of vulnerability. They learned to view all human interaction through the lens of political calculation rather than genuine connection, preparing them for adult relationships built upon manipulation rather than trust. The progressive escalation of psychological pressure followed carefully planned stages that built upon previous conditioning while introducing new forms of stress designed to push royal children beyond their breaking points and then rebuild them according to desired specifications. What began as simple obedience training evolved into complex scenarios that tested their ability to maintain composure under increasingly extreme circumstances. Advanced exercises might involve mock assassination attempts, where palace guards would burst into the child's chambers with drawn swords, demanding split-second decisions about trust and betrayal. Royal children learned to evaluate threats, assess loyalties, and make life or death calculations while maintaining the external calm expected of monarchs. These exercises were repeated with variations until appropriate responses became automatic rather than conscious choices. The systematic destruction of empathy represented perhaps the most crucial element of royal conditioning, requiring techniques that gradually numbed natural human compassion, while preserving the intellectual capacity necessary for effective rule. Royal children were required to observe punishments inflicted upon servants for increasingly minor offences, beginning with mild corrections and progressing to brutal executions carried out specifically for their education. The marble floors of Versailles still echo with the footsteps of those broken children who survived their transformation into living crowns, their humanity sacrificed upon altars of absolute power. These royal heirs, moulded through centuries of systematic psychological torture, became the very monarchs who would perpetuate these same brutal traditions upon their own offspring. The gilded cages that shaped kings and queens remind us that absolute power corrupts absolutely, beginning with the innocent children chosen by birth to bear its terrible weight. In understanding their suffering, we glimpse the true cost of the divine right of kings.